Nation. Just saying it, it kind of hits different, right? Like,
Uh,
we rally behind it, celebrate it, wars get fought over it.
Definitely. Powerful word.
But have you ever actually tried to, like, define nationalism? What it actually is?
Yeah, it's surprisingly tough.
That's what this whole deep dive is about. We're in chapter 7 of this political theory book, and right off the bat, it's clear that nationalism is way more complex than just waving a flag on a holiday. You
It
know,
really is. Even scholars debate it constantly, which I think is what makes it so important to unpack. Because whether we realize it or not, nationalism, it's shaped so much of history, revolutions, even how the world's organized now with nation states, right?
you said nation states, and the book brings up this whole period, 19th century Europe. Nationalism was like the driving force behind stuff like Germany and Italy forming, but then also huge empires breaking up. So is it unifying or dividing? It's kind of both, isn't it?
That's the core tension, right? It brings people together under a shared identity, but then that so often means excluding or even demonizing those who are outside that identity. Like even today, you've got the Quebecois in Canada, the Basque in Spain. They're all using the language of nationalism, but for separatist movements.
It's interesting you say that because one thing that really made me think was this phrase imagined community
Mm.
to describe a nation.
Oh,
It's
yeah.
not just shared genes or always even language, according to this chapter. So what's the glue?
So they break it down into four main things.
Yeah.
First, you got to have shared beliefs. Basically, a nation exists partly because its people believe it does, like a shared vision for the future, common goals.
So more shared dreams than shared ancestors. That's wild.
Exactly. And then there's the history part. Nations, they tell stories about their past, even if those stories are kind of, you know,
Embellished.
exactly, mythologized even. But it reinforces that feeling of we're in this together. It's about where we came from.
So we've got, like, the future we're aiming for, the origin story. But it's not all on our heads, right? There's a physical aspect, too.
You got it. It's deeply connected to a place, a homeland. And that's where things get messy fast. Because multiple groups might claim that same land, each with their own story, their own feeling of belonging. Think about like Israel and Palestine. Who gets to call it home is at the core of the conflict.
It really makes you think about how history isn't just dates and names, right? It's the stories we weave around them that shape our whole understanding.
Totally. And that leads us to the fourth thing, which really sets a nation apart from, say, just a tribe. It's shared political ideals,
Okay.
wanting self-government, being able to control your own destiny. That's where the right to self-determination comes in.
Which, as the chapter gets into, is a whole other can of worms. Sounds good in theory, but
Oh, tell me about it. The 20th century alone is full of examples where this right led to huge conflicts. They use the example of the Basque people, right?
Right.
They've got their own distinct culture, language, even a history of some autonomy within Spain. But them wanting full-on independence, that's controversial, to say the least.
makes you wonder, like, at what point does a group's right to go their own way outweigh keeping a state unified? And who gets to decide that? Not easy questions at all.
No, they're not. It's a balancing act, and
Yeah.
there's no one answer that fits every situation. And to make it even more complex, we got to factor in pluralism.
Oh, right. Can those two even coexist? Nationalism and pluralism?
Exactly.
Because it seems like a lot of democracies are struggling with that right now, right?
Yeah.
How do you balance that desire for everyone to feel like they're part of something bigger
Yeah.
with also respecting all the different identities within a nation? It's a tightrope walk for sure.
For sure. You want people to feel connected to their nation, invested in it. But you also don't want to erase what makes different groups within that nation unique. It's about finding a way for those identities to exist without undermining the whole idea of national unity. And this is something the chapter digs into, especially through India's experience.
Which is fascinating because India is so incredibly diverse, all those languages, religions, ethnicities. They even mention how India's constitution goes to great lengths to protect those different identities, right?
That's pretty remarkable. They've really embraced this model of pluralism. It basically means recognizing and respecting that there are multiple groups within a society, each with their own beliefs, values, ways of life. And
Yeah.
instead of trying to make everyone the same, they're focused on building a system where that diversity can actually thrive while still being Indian.
So it's like group rights matter, but within this bigger framework of national unity.
Exactly. It's recognizing that a nation, it's not one thing. It's made up of individuals, each with their own stories and perspectives.
It's like the more we become citizens of the world, the more those smaller, more local identities matter.
Yeah.
Kind of ironic.
It is interesting, and it's playing out everywhere. The chapter even talks about how globalization has, like, impacted India specifically. On the one hand, it's brought economic growth, opportunity,
Right.
but then there's this worry about cultural homogenization.
Yeah.
Like, will Western influence kind of steamroll traditional Indian values and customs?
It's that balance between like preserving what makes a culture unique and adapting to a changing world. And it's not just India dealing with it, right? It seems like every nation is trying to figure out this whole globalization thing while holding on to their identity.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it plays out so differently depending on the context. Like the chapter talks about how globalization affects separatist movements. On one hand, it can create a sense of shared grievance, make it easier for these groups to connect across
Really
borders.
nice. Yes.
Exactly. But then it can also make separatism less appealing because you've got economic ties, more cross-cultural understanding.
So it can fuel the desire to separate and the potential to integrate further. What a weird paradox.
Totally. It shows how complex nationalism is in this day and age.
Yeah.
There's no simple answer. It keeps changing, being reshaped by all these global forces.
Which actually makes me think of something else the chapter brings up, those stories we tell ourselves about our past. We talked earlier about how nations need those shared narratives to create a sense of, we're in this together, but.
Yeah.
What if people disagree about those narratives? Like different groups within a nation having different versions of history.
That's huge. The chapter talks about how creating national identity often involves crafting a specific story about the past,
Mhm.
highlighting certain events or figures, downplaying others,
Right, right.
and that choosing what to emphasize, how to interpret things,
Mhm.
is powerful stuff because it shapes how people see their nation's place in the world.
I wonder how many people realize how much of a nation's history is actually like a carefully constructed narrative. We tend to think of history as being objective, but the reality is. And it's often told from a specific point of view with a purpose in mind.
Absolutely. And sometimes those dominant narratives end up pushing aside or even silencing the stories of certain groups within a nation. Like the chapter uses the example of how colonialism's history is often told from the perspective of the colonizers.
Yeah.
They did this, they achieved that, but the experiences of the people being colonized
Right.
often overlooked.
It's like we need to be careful not to just accept the one version of history we're given. We got to look for those missing voices, those alternative perspectives, because history isn't just about the past. It's about how we make sense of it now, and that shapes everything.
100%. And that's why it's so important to be able to have these conversations about history, even when they're tough, even when they make us uncomfortable. Because acknowledging where we went wrong, challenging those dominant narratives, it's not about tearing things down. It's about understanding how we got here so we can build something better.
And speaking of building something better, this chapter doesn't just leave us with all these like big questions about nationalism. It actually talks about ways forward, especially for democracies. What are some of the things they highlight?
Well, one of the big ones is this idea of what they call inclusive nation building. Basically moving away from thinking of a nation as this one homogeneous blob, and instead recognizing and valuing the fact that it's made up of all these different people, different experiences.
Right.
It's about creating a society where everyone feels like they belong, like they have a stake in it no matter their background.
Which sounds great, but how do you actually do that? Like, practically speaking, how do you balance that desire for unity with, making sure everyone feels seen and respected for who they are?
It's definitely a challenge, but the chapter points to some concrete things.
Mm.
One is constitutional protections for minority groups, making sure they have a voice in government.
So they're not just being spoken for, they're part of the conversation.
Exactly. Some countries even have systems where minority groups are guaranteed a certain number of seats in parliament, so their perspective is always represented.
So everyone's at the table. I like that.
Exactly. Because a nation is stronger when it can draw on the talents and perspectives of all its citizens, right? And it's not just about the political stuff either. It's about creating a culture of respect, where people from different backgrounds can talk to each other, understand each other, and of course, fighting discrimination wherever it pops up.
It's like we have to get to a place where we see diversity not as a threat, but as something that makes us stronger, more resilient.
Absolutely. And the chapter actually uses a really powerful phrase to sum this up. The political identity of a citizen should encompass the different identities which people may have.
I love that.
So basically, you can be proud of your heritage, your language, your religion, all of it, and still be a committed citizen of your nation. Those things aren't mutually exclusive.
It's like we contain multitudes, right? We can
Right.
hold all these different identities, local, national, global, and they can all coexist, even enrich each other.
Exactly. Our identities are complex, and that's okay.
Yeah.
It's about embracing that complexity and finding ways to connect with each other across those differences.
So, to kind of bring this all back home, it seems like what we're learning from this deep dive is that nationalism is way more than just flags and anthems. It's about our beliefs, our sense of belonging, and this constant back and forth between like wanting to be part of something bigger and holding on to what makes us unique.
Well said. And as the world gets more and more interconnected, wrapping our heads around all of this is more important than ever. Because nationalism, when you get it right, can be an incredible force for good, bringing people together, inspiring them to work towards a common goal.
Right.
But we've also seen how easily it can be twisted, used to divide us, turn us against each other.
It's a responsibility, really. We have to be willing to question our assumptions, to engage with these ideas in a thoughtful way, and to work towards a future where nationalism brings us together instead of tearing us apart.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Yeah.
Food for thought for everyone listening. How can we, as individuals, as global citizens, make sure nationalism is a force for good in the world? How do we make sure it's building bridges, not walls?